Good morning and welcome, everyone. My name is Karen Richardson, and I am a current member of the Pacific Council and formerly with the U.S. Department of State in the White House during the Obama administration. And it is my pleasure to be here to welcome all of you here this morning, those who are here in person, but those who are also tuning in via the live stream, and to introduce what is sure to be a very fascinating segment of this conference. Many of you are already familiar with a TED-style talk, but before we get started, I want to give you a sense of what you're in for this morning. We are very fortunate to have 4 incredible speakers here today, and this is how it's going to work. Each speaker is going to have 10 minutes to present their topic, and the topics, as you've heard, include trade, elections, climate change, and the 4th Industrial Revolution. As you know, all of these topics are at the center and the forefront of discussions on national security today. So after the 4th speaker is finished, all the speakers will then return to the stage and participate in a question and answer period with all of you. And if you would like to participate in the Q&A session, we ask that you please stand and go to the standing mic in the back that we have for you. We will have somebody who will signal it right over there so you're able to ask your question. So with that, I would like to introduce our first speaker. And just a note, these abbreviated biographies do not do justice to the wonderful backgrounds, so please be sure to check out their full biographies online or on the app. They will blow you away. So we're very fortunate to have as our first speaker, Patrick Schaefer. Patrick is the Executive Director of the Hunt Institute for Global Competitiveness at the University of Texas, El Paso. The Institute produces economic and legal analyses of the markets that comprise the Paso del Norte region. Patrick will be speaking on the future of international trade and LA's place within it. Here's the perfect place to do that. Please join me in welcoming Patrick to the stage.
The world, it seems, has never been more connected or more divided. The natural and timeless forces of movement, migration, exchange, and trade have brought all of us together in unprecedented ways with unprecedented speed. At the same time, the forces of division, isolation, and separation have grown just as quickly. How did this come to be? What is the nature of this conflict between division and unity? What is the role that cities like Los Angeles will have in this conflict in the years to come? But most importantly, how have these two forces over the last decades affected Los Angeles with respect to its trade connectivity, and what will that mean going forward into the future? The origin of this conflict between division and unity finds its recent origins in the aftermath of the Second World War and the devastation that raged across Europe. Places like Rotterdam were almost completely annihilated. What today is one of the most busiest ports in the world, and now the busiest port in Europe. There was an absence of moral leadership and great material deprivation. There was an absence of leadership. In the shadow of these events, leaders from the international community started to build institutions to respond to this moral crisis as well as material crisis. They built institutions like the World Bank to help countries rebuild after the war. They built institutions like the International Monetary Fund to help stabilize exchange rates, to support the international trading system. But what they also did was they created, here in Geneva, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. This was a rules-based international trading system to make sure that countries and their exports would have fair and open access to neighboring and partner markets. Over time, over the decades, the tariff barriers that the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs managed reduced more and more up until the late 1990s when the GATT became the WTO. At the same time that tariff barriers were being reduced around the world, there was another movement afoot. This was to open countries to foreign capital. For many years in the pre- and post-war period, particularly developing countries wanted to restrict the market access for foreign capital in their countries. This is a treaty, the first bilateral investment treaty between Germany and Pakistan from 1961. An inauspicious start, perhaps, as many of us have never even heard of this bilateral investment treaty. But this kind of effort would have a significant effect throughout the 20th century and now into the 21st century. In particular, these two forces converged in the North American Free Trade Agreement. This was the first time that a multilateral investment treaty was combined with an agreement to reduce tariffs continuously over time between member states, Canada, Mexico, and the United States. What it also did was, and as we'll see later in the data regarding Los Angeles' trading relationships, build an integrated industrial platform at a continental level between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. But something else was happening. Something was happening in Europe as well. They were pushing integration even further than North America was pushing economic and trade integration. They even went so far as to create in the late 1990s a treaty of the European Union and then the Amsterdam Treaty, which created a single monetary system with a European central bank to regulate monetary policy between the member states. Then, shortly thereafter, China joined the WTO. And as we'll see in the data that I mentioned earlier, this created a revolution not only in world trade, but also the trading implications for the state of California and for Los Angeles. But not all was well. And fissures over time began to emerge, particularly in recent years. There were debates about the moral bases for these trade agreements, about the moral bases for these international investment treaties, and also the material deprivations that some communities suffered and others did not. In 2016, the United Kingdom voted to leave the European Union. Now, this has not only caused significant turmoil at home in the United Kingdom, but also cast great uncertainty with respect to the short, medium, and long-term growth prospects and trade integration program of the European Union. And this is significant because, as I was mentioning earlier, in that post-war period, these trade agreements and trading systems were not meant merely to facilitate accumulation of capital or increase profits, but to stabilize trading relationships across nations so that they wouldn't go to war with each other again. The old saw that nations that trade together do not go to war together. In more recent times, the current administration of the United States has been acting in an aggressive way with respect to previous trade agreements that were long held as pillars of this international trading system. NAFTA has become a target. Duties and tariffs were levied on Mexican steel and aluminum and Canadian steel and aluminum. But perhaps what is more dramatic is the way that the bilateral tariffs between the United States and China are progressing. This is an announcement from the USTR for coming tariffs to be increased in December of 2019. This, though, doesn't just touch trade. It doesn't just touch goods and even services. This also affects fundamentally people, because people, individuals, families, they are at the origin of all trade, all movement, and all exchange. Well, what does this mean for Los Angeles? How has Los Angeles been involved with this trading regime in the last 50 years, 20 years, 10 years? What does it mean for the future of Los Angeles? And what does it mean for the future of the world? I'd like to take a minute and just show you the geographic position of Los Angeles and how special it is. You see that it's there at the southern point of California, and it has deep hinterland connections into North America, into the Great Lakes through Albuquerque and Chicago, into Houston through El Paso and Texas, and onto New Orleans and Jacksonville, as well as northward up to the Canadian border. At the same time, it has privileged access to maritime trade routes, the entire Pacific coast of North and South America and East Asia. And we'll see how important that is to the city and the trading relationship of Los Angeles in a minute. Also, Los Angeles is a significant strategic value for air traffic, particularly air freight cargo. And we'll look at the trading partners that Los Angeles engages with. But first, I'd like to show you, just to put some meat on the bone, so to speak, as how global trade has increased in these decades of the 20th century and into the 21st century. And you can clearly see here that just at that time in the late 1990s and the early 2000s, how those trade agreements all consolidated. NAFTA, the European Union, China's entry into the WTO, resulted in a veritable explosion of trading at the global level. Now, I also wanted to show you the effect that this had on the economy of the Los Angeles metropolitan statistical area. So as global trade increased, so did the GDP of Los Angeles, almost with the same curves. I'd also like to point out, as it will become important to note in future slides, the downturn of 2008, as well as in 2015 and 2016. So interestingly, what we see from this graph as well is despite a lot of the trade fragilities and the supposed trade wars that are going on, trade is still increasing. With respect to total trade through the Los Angeles Customs Port District, we see that most of that trade is to Asia, and that's by maritime vessel. But this graph shows all modes of transportation, not just maritime vessel, but also air and whatever comes by land. So Asia is far, far ahead of the other trading regions of Europe or even North America. I'd also like to take a moment and show you the level of foreign direct investment at the state level in California, because what I was kind of alluding to earlier is that foreign direct investment and free trade agreements are the 2 feet upon which the international trading system has walked on and is struggling to continue to walk on. If countries are allowed to invest reciprocally, have their investments protected, and have a dispute resolution with respect to nationalization or expropriation, they're much more willing to invest in those other countries. At the same time, goods produced as the fruit of those investments find an easy, tariff-free access to world markets. And this has been the pillar and the bedrock of the post-war international trading system. What we see here in California is that the major FDI partners, this is employees for the country of majority-owned US affiliates, is Japan, followed by United Kingdom, France, and Germany. And that will be when we look with respect to trade. Now, with respect to maritime trade, Los Angeles, its ports of Long Beach and Los Angeles, are some of the biggest and most important in the world. Now, Los Angeles has had a very, very important trading relationship with China, and these are exports to China. China leads in exports, even though the Port of Los Angeles imports far more than it exports. So China is the leader here with exports, but if you look, given the trade war, exports to China have diminished from California, while other trading partners have remained relatively stable. With respect to the imports, China is far and away the leading country from which Los Angeles imports its goods, so much so that we even had to split the graph to fit it on this slide for you. The second most important trading partner for exports or imports for Los Angeles is Japan. I'd like you to take a note and look at the third leading country for imports. It's Vietnam. And much of that is because due to the trade war and the tariffs that have been imposed on China, they've been trying to shift their production to Vietnam so that they can get their goods to the US market with lower cost. Los Angeles also has significant air cargo capacity, as I mentioned earlier. The leading export markets for Los Angeles, again, is China by air and Hong Kong. So we're continuing to see this trend of the importance of the Asian countries' relationship to our city and to our region. There's also more diversity here with respect to air cargo than maritime cargo, including European nations and other Asian nations. With respect to imports, again, China leads with how much the Port of Los Angeles and Los Angeles International Airport brings in from China. And notice here that it's much more focused towards Asian countries. Again, whether by maritime vessel or by air cargo, Los Angeles is importing many, many, many products from Asia and Southeast Asia. But it's not just a place for goods. And I'd like to take a moment here to really focus on the core of trade and movement, and that's people. The airport in Los Angeles International Airport, has seen tremendous growth with respect to international air traffic. So these are all passengers that come from foreign airports to LA or go from LA to foreign airports. And we see here similar growth rates that we saw with respect to goods at the ports and at the airport. The top international airports partners that Los Angeles have, no surprise, include Hong Kong, but interestingly, Mexico and Guadalajara. Now, this is important because Mexico and the routes that Mexico provides for Los Angeles go very deep. So they're not just part of our history and part of our present, but clearly part of our future. The Los Angeles Metropolitan Statistical Area foreign-born population is dominated by people who come from the Americas and also people who come from Asia. But if you look closely at the countries that they come from, it's no surprise that Los Angeles has more foreign-born people from Mexico, around 1.7 million, than any other country. And China has around 320,000 foreign-born people. But you'll notice that while Mexico is declining, China is increasing. So what does this mean? What does it mean in the face of bilateral tariffs, trade wars, trade uncertainty, moral and material conflicts around the world? I'd like to take our attention back to a different time and a different place, but that had similar problems that we have today in Los Angeles and around the world. This is a map of the warring factions in the Peloponnesian War in the 5th century BC in Greece. On the one hand, you had Athens, which was a nominally democratic, free trading state, and against Sparta, which was an oligarchic, militaristic, land-based empire. Certainly a clash of morals and certainly a clash of material strength. Well, during this time, there was a gentleman named Socrates, and he liked to talk and he liked to have conversations. And he went down to the port of Piraeus, as he says in the first line of the Republic. And why did he go to the port of Piraeus? Because he was going to have a discussion with friends, both foreigners and Athenians alike, about the nature of justice. And he wanted to talk about the nature of justice because all around him was swirling conflict at the international level between the city-states and also within the city-states. And the question became, well, how do we know what justice is? We have to look at the individual, but how do we understand that? Well, let's look at the city first, and let's look at the polis. And based on that, Socrates was able to use Piraeus' special position as the leading maritime and trade hub of the classical world to try and understand what justice was and how that could be communicated for a better future, both morally and materially. Socrates had a message, and he was a messenger. And I think that today we can take many of those same lessons from the method that he articulated in the Republic. This is our city, and in many ways we're similarly disposed to ancient Athens and Piraeus. Within our city, we have the opportunity to work with each other to find out what is the right way to live, what is the just way to live. But the other thing is that Socrates didn't just have a message, he was also a messenger. Angelos. Socrates' message has come down to us through time, from the port of Piraeus, throughout the classical world, throughout the centuries, throughout the millennia, so that we're even talking about it here today. Well, angelos isn't just something that we see with Socrates. We see it in our city. The city of Los Angeles is the city of the Angelos, de Los Angeles. So all of us here in this city and in this region are messengers. We have the ability to work with each other to understand the world through our connectivity with the world, and then share our best ideas so that not only our community and our city can prosper and improve its well-being, but that we can share that with the rest of the world. I close by showing you this map of the Pacific trade routes from 1723, published in Paris. Now, I love Paris, and it's a very beautiful place. But as I was showing you earlier, time has changed, and it's not Athens anymore, and it's not Paris anymore. This is the time for Los Angeles, and this is the time for our city. I can think of no other city in the world where you can learn about the world, where you can see the world, and that you can be of service to the world. Thank you very much.